What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're breaking down my picks for the wackiest and most surprising lists from the 2022 Warhammer 40,000 World Team Championship. For those who don't know, the World Team Championship, or WTC, is an annual Warhammer 40,000 tournament where the 8 best players are invited from each nation to compete to prove their country's skill at the eternal art of pushing tiny toy soldiers across the table and rolling dice at each other and occasionally yelling. This makes it, theoretically, one of the most competitive Warhammer 40,000 events in the entire world. That said, the format of the WTC is very different from that of a normal Warhammer 40,000 tournament, and that can influence the faction picks that we see taken by these teams. During a round at the WTC, while each player plays a normal 2,000 point game of Grand Tournament format Warhammer 40,000, instead of scoring a raw victory point total, they're effectively graded on the differential between the victory points of the two players, splitting a score of 20 between the two. That means that a big blowout win could be a 20-0 or a 19-1, whereas a very close game could be an 11-9 or 12-8. This means that the format incentivizes those big wins or narrow losses, since in a close round, you can win even if your team won less games than your opponent, as long as the wins that you did get were big and the losses that you got were relatively slim. In addition, each team can only bring one instance of each faction, so you'll never see multiple Space Marine or Tyranid armies on a nation's team, for example. This incentivizes teams to populate themselves with a selection of the top factions in the game. And this year's WTC saw most teams running a composition that featured pretty prominently factions like Tyranids, Adeptus, Necrons, Tau, and the various varieties of Knight. But not every player took one of these top factions. Sometimes teams will take off factions to cover their other players' weak spots, and often faction familiarity trumps the raw power level of that army, especially when you're in a format where every individual victory point might matter a lot when it comes to that score differential. So, small mistakes in a faction that a player might be unfamiliar with can add up in a big way. Teams also take the opportunity to flex a little bit on the other teams in the event and show off their skill with lesser played factions. And those are what we're going to be talking about today. So let's talk about the zaniest lists in the 2022 WTC. I've chosen them from the top placing teams, and we're going to be talking about them in ascending order. So the first list we're going to talk about today is from the Warhammer Undivided team. This was not a team from a particular country, but a bunch of strong individual players who all decided to play together. It's kind of, I guess, a catch-all team for people who want to join the WTC but aren't necessarily part of a particular nations team. Kind of a United Nations team, I guess. This is mostly an honorable mention because I'm biased and like Tyranids, and so we're going to talk about a Tyranids list. This one from Daniil Tirtashov, who played a Behemoth list. Quite a bit different than the normal Kraken or Leviathan list that we've been seeing out of other Tyranid players. This one bringing pretty normal composition of a Hive Tyrant, Neurothrope, big Burk of Warriors, as well as a bunch of small Ravener units in order to play some forward aggressive primary or secondary objective scoring. It is a double detachment list, so it can bring a second Hive Tyrant, a Foot Hive Tyrant, as well as a Tyrannifex and a Harpy. This one is taking the territorial instinct of adaptive trait, which means that those Hive Tyrants and Tyrannifex all get objective secured. It seemed like he was a relatively heavy hitter on the Undivided team, going in to try to score those big 20-0 victories, and especially against Blood Angels, who he got matched up with 3 different times. This put him at a pretty strong record with a 14-6 win against Adeptus Sororitas versus Finland, 17-3 versus the Greek Blood Angels player, although we do have a mark on the record, 0-20 versus Australian Necrons. Australians did go to win the entire event, so that's not too bad of a result, and Necrons are super good at scoring. I can definitely see that if you're not able to kill them quickly enough, they would be able to 20-0 you pretty well. But we did get a 20-0 against Austria versus Eldari, an 18-2 against the Danish Blood Angels player, a loss 7-13 versus the Irish Chaos Knights player, and another win 12-8 versus, in the final round, the Belgian Blood Angels player. This put them at a grand total of 5-2. Pretty good result for Tyranids, although you would hope the Tyranids would be able to squeak out a 7-0 if you're able to get good matchups for them. But it may also have been that Tyranids are so strong, we were just hoping that they would be able to fight their way out of some bad matchups, and things ended up not going their way, especially in that awkward Australian game. Now let's move on to a little bit more of a funky faction. Let's go to the 14th place team, Switzerland, whose player, Pierrick Willemines, and I'm sure these are European names, are going to get butchered, so I apologize to everyone ahead of time, but he played an Astra Militarum Cadian Brigade. That's right, some old school 8th edition style energy here, bringing Lord Castellan Creed, 3 tank commanders, including 2 standard tank commanders, and Knight Commander Pask, making use of that gorgeous 2+ T8 Armor of Contempt defensive profile on those Leman Russ battle tanks. That's followed up by a grand total of 60 infantry, 6 infantry squads with decked out with those free weapon upgrades now, plasma guns, Vosscasters, heavy weapons, and power swords with plasma pistols on those sergeants as well. 2 units of 5 Militarum Tempestus Scions to score out those secondary objectives, alongside a bunch of characters, 3 command squads, 3 scout sentinels, 3 basilisks, and a chimera. Pretty sweet. Cadians do have some pretty good matchups into the metagame, being able to bring Relic of Lost Cadia for a big bonus in Chaos matchups like Chaos Knight and Heretic Astartes, who did see some play in the event, although things didn't go so well for our Swiss friend here, losing rounds 1 to 3, clinching a win against the Greek Chaos Knights player, getting a draw, a 10-10 draw against Norwegian Tau, and a win versus Portuguese Death Guard. I believe at the end of the day that give them a 2-4-1 record. Not super great, but still nice to see Astra Militarum taking some names in what is ostensibly the most competitive event of the year. And that moves us on to the next pick, the Netherlands, whose player Christian Domberg brought Orks to an 8th place spot for his team. This is a classic Horde Orc style build. We're not bringing any Speed Wasp today. We're not bringing Kill Rig. This is a Snakebite detachment. In the first detachment, a War Boss, just a standard foot War Boss with the Killa Claw, as well as Brutal but Cunning. 2 big units of 15 Beast Snagga Boys, as well as a standard 12 Orc Truck Boy squad to go in one of the trucks. The 2nd Battalion detachment, which does have the Warlord in it to get that CP discount, is bringing a Beast Boss. These characters not on mounts, by the way. We don't have the Squigosaur bosses or even bike bosses today. That Beast Boss bringing a Super Cyborg body, as well as a Pain Boss, 2 additional units of Beast Snagga Boys. So for those keeping track, a total of 60 ground-pounding Beast Snagga Boys running across the table, as well as another unit of 12 Truck Boys, 30 Gretchen to hold backline objectives, 2 units of Commandos to add that front line forward deploy screening, scoring Recover the Relics, getting those CP early, which is very useful, and being able to disrupt enemy scoring on their forward objectives. We have 2 units of Mega Knobs, as well as 2 units of Storm Boys. Those are 10 Storm Boys, by the way, so we have overall a very aggressive style of lists, as well as the 2 trucks to keep those Truck Boy units in. Obviously, those Truck Boys are going to be able to disembark after the transport moves, which on their WA turn gives them a potentially massive threat range, being able to get up and touch opponents' objectives. We also have a little bit of additional technology coming out of the Snakebite subfaction themselves. Obviously, the entire army gets a situational transhuman on weapons of strength 7 or less, as well as having a 1 CP strat to deny with any of your models. The fact that we don't have a Weird Boy in this list does potentially open up the pick for Abhor the Witch and still protect yourself against Psychic Interrogation with that 1 CP deny roll. Otherwise, this list just mostly looks like a ton of bodies who are going to play very aggressively to try to score, at the very least, close losses, since you'll probably be able to dominate primary for the first couple turns of the game with the number of Orc Boys on the table here. We had a resounding win in round 1 for this list against a Latvian Space Marine player, a loss versus Anthony Vanilla's Tyranids coming out of the US team in round 2, a win versus the Icelandic Knights player, loss versus Italian Thousand Suns, as well as a loss versus English Knights. Unfortunately, the team got destroyed, almost scoring no differential points this round by the English team, losing versus Canadian Custodes, and a big loss against French Sororitas. It does seem like this list was thrown to the wolves a little bit with a lot of losses, but hopefully with scoring enough to keep those losses relatively tight. And that moves us on to talking about some of the top teams. We're going to go to Team USA, where we have some hometown heroes over here playing some really interesting lists. First up, let's talk about John Lennon playing Adeptus Custodes. This is an Emperor's Chosen double detachment, bringing a patrol detachment as well as a Vanguard to unlock additional elite slots. And this is one of the most interesting Adeptus Custodes SKU lists that I've seen in a really long time. You'll see a lot of Knights lists and other similar SKUs in the WTC because you're hoping that you can identify enemy armies that can't deal with a particular profile. In this case, a T7 profile with a solid invulnerable save. And if you can spam that profile at your opponent and navigate them into a matchup that your opponent isn't going to be able to deal with, that can potentially win you big points. In this case, this patrol detachment is led by a shield captain in Alaris Terminator armor, as well as a unit of 3 Custodian Guard who constitute, I believe, the only objective secured in the entire list, an unfortunate symptom of the post-data slate Adeptus Custodes army, where they went from having a ton of objective secured to having very little. We do have 2 Caladius Grav tanks, no upgrades on them, so I believe that they're just equipped with the Iliastis Accelerator Cannon, their big auto cannon 2 damage profile, as well as a unit of Void's Men-at-Arms. We have in the Vanguard detachment a ton of Dreadnoughts, an additional Caladius Grav tank, so 3 total for those keeping track, a second Shield Captain with Castellan's Mark to allow some redeploys, 3 Contemptor Achilles Dreadnoughts, that's the one with the big scary spear, gonna go and try to cut some knights in half with that guy, as well as 3 Contemptor Dreadnoughts. These are not the specialist Contemptors like the Contemptor Galidus or the Contemptor Achilles. These are standard Contemptor Dreadnoughts with a big fist and a multi-melta on the other side, which does give you a pretty cheap option to fill out that remaining front line of -1 damage models with a 5+ invulnerable save. Super interesting to see a list like this taken. Given the matchups that John played, I imagine it was a silver bullet list to fight Knights lists, which it did get paired into a lot, as well as Adeptus Sororitas. It was able to take a 20-0 victory against Iceland's Knights player in round 1, moving on to a Drukhari matchup, 12-8, a very close win. Drukhari able to play very aggressively and with a lot of predominance of objective secured means that they can potentially steal some points away from a list like this. 15-5 win against Latvian Knights, a 20-0 against the English Knights player, as well as a 19-1 against the Australian Sororitas player, although that round did end in a draw between Australia and the US. An 18-2 win against Polish Sororitas, although the US did lose that round, followed up by a very close loss, 9-11, versus the German Death Guard player in the final game. This means that this Adeptus Custodes list went 6-1 with a bunch of 20-0s, meaning that it was navigated into the matchups it was really good at playing, which apparently are these Knights and Sororitas players. Against those two factions, it ended up going 5-0 with a total of 55 out of a potential 60 points scored against Knights and 37 out of a potential 40 scored against Sororitas, only dropping 8 points across those games. Seems like it had struggled in the matchups that it wasn't designed for, however. And that does go to show you how specifically these lists are sometimes constructed for particular matchups. Moving on, we have another player in the US, Richard Siegler, who we've talked about on the channel in the past with his Adeptus Mechanicus play. Siegler is potentially the best 40k player on the planet right now, especially as the current ITC champion. He's bringing what is, I think, a very odd variety of Adeptus Mechanicus. It's interesting to see Adeptus Mechanicus on a stage like this to begin with, and even if we did see one, I was not expecting an Agrippina battalion to come out of Richard Siegler's army. This one was bringing the Skitarii veteran cohort Armory of Renown, allowing only Skitarii units, as well as a couple tech priests to be played, but unlocking some additional abilities for those units. This is bringing a Skitarii Marshal with a Cantic Thrallnet, as well as Programmed Retreat to allow fallback and shooting with these models, and this army is generally going to be designed to play very defensively. We also have 2 tech priests, a Dominus and a Manipulus, upgraded with Logi and Artisans, Holy Orders, respectively. 2 big unit of Skitarii Ranger veterans to bring those huge galvanic rifle volleys to the table, a unit of 20 with a Firepoint telemetry cache, as well as a unit of 17, and an additional unit of 5 just to hold backline objectives. That's followed up by a ton of Sicarian Rust Stalkers, a unit of 9 with a Tempora Corpia to force enemies to fight last, as well as 2 units of 6. Last but certainly not least, we have a unit of 3 Cerberus Raiders and 10 Iron Strider Ballistari, 5 of them equipped with Cognis Las cannons, the other 5 with their base auto cannons. That Agrippina bonus does give the army +1 AP at half range, making it very effective if you move aggressively towards it, and every model in the army is effectively always counted as being in defensible terrain, allowing them to either overwatch on 5s or get +1 to hit in melee if they're responding to a charge. I imagine that this army was taken as a jack of all trades, able to play very defensively, use those defensive effects to give themselves some additional punch, especially especially against Armor of Contempt enemies with that +1 AP. And with a mix of defensive effects and fight last effects, this army could take an aggressive army and potentially attrition it out to a very close victory. In round 1, Siegler was able to pull a 20-0 against the Icelandic Custodes player, a 16-4 against Netherlands Sororitas, 11-9 very close win against the Latvian Tau player. Paired up against English Necrons, was able to score out a 12-8. That's a very tough matchup and a very high scoring one, so being able to win is already very exciting, and at a 12-8 is pretty good too. Unfortunately, we did see our one loss here against the Australian Tyranids player, Simon Gashgovic, 7-7-13. Tyranids one of the strongest armies in the format for sure, so not too surprising there. A win against Polish Chaos Knights, 13-7, and before moving on to the final game, 12-8 versus the German Drukari player. That's Fred Oho from Breaking Heads, by the way, big friend of the channel. Definitely go check him out if you like some German Warhammer 40k content. But that put this wild Adeptus Mechanicus army at 6-1 at the end of the day, with a bunch of narrow wins against some of the strongest factions in the format, and definitely goes to show you that faction mastery in a format like this is worth a lot by itself. But with that, we're going to move on to the last list we're going to talk about today, and this is Australia, whose player, Eric Lathuris, brought Genestealer Cults, which ended up giving Australia the #1 spot. Genestealer Cults have been struggling pretty hard, especially through the GT Nachmund and Nephilim seasons, so it's really cool to see them kind of come into their own. And I think it's important to mention that we have seen Genestealer Cults win rates improving slowly over the last couple of weeks, and Germany, whose player Florian Schmidt, also brought a similar Genestealer Cults list to a very high placing. Eric Lathuris' list was bringing a custom cult, using the unique custom cult mechanics for Genestealer Cult to get 4 subfaction abilities out of his army. Unlike most chapter tactics and subfaction abilities can get 1 or 2 abilities, no. Genestealer Cults, they get 4. And that's going to give almost the entirety of the army a 6+ damage ignore on their bikers and vehicles, +1 AP on 6s to wound, a stalwart effect from Accustomed to Toil, so wound rolls of 1 or 2 automatically fail on the entirety of the army. You can't wound them on 2s, even if you have wound bonuses, and they ignore modifiers to hit with heavy weapons. Otherwise, this was a relatively standard style of Genestealer Cult's list. This was bringing a battalion detachment from that custom cult, as I talked about before, with 4 units of Acolyte hybrids, one of them bringing Perfect Ambush to expose units within 12 inches once they're set up, those guys bringing a bunch of Hand Flamers, 2 units of Neophyte hybrids, one of them bringing Lying in Wait, and a bunch of shotguns to be able to deep strike outside 3 inches of their target. That's followed up by 3 additional units of Acolyte hybrids, just 5 mans to sit around and grab some secondary objectives. We have the classic Genestealer Cult brace of characters, including a Kellermorth, Nexos, and a Sanctus with proficient planning, allowing them to arrive from Strategic Reserve Huff of Table Edge a turn earlier, potentially allowing them to come in on the first battle round. That's followed up by a 10-man unit of Pure Stirring Genestealers, with they came from below to allow the unit a pre-game move. This is a classic tool in Genestealer Cult's list that allow them to really put a lot of turn 1 pressure on their opponent and potentially lock them, or at least their most important units, into their deployment zone, allowing the Genestealer Cult player to push for center objectives and score big 12-point primary turns very early. That's followed up by 3 units of 8 Atalan Jackals with 2 Wolf Quads in each unit. These Atalan Jackals are going to combo with the Acolyte Icon Ward, who allows them to regenerate models back to the squad, and are very difficult to kill with a permanent -1 to be hit and that 6+ damage ignore from their subfaction ability. Also benefiting from that subfaction ability are 3 Goliath Rock Grinders. These things have a built-in -1 damage and are similarly super tanky. These combos have been kind of core to how Genestealer Cults take territory. While they are very good at diving on their opponent out of reserve and doing a bunch of damage, their units are not very survivable outside of these vehicles and bikers. Very cool to see a style of list like this coming out of Australia, and obviously did pretty well for them. This list actually ended up going undefeated, starting with a 16-4 win against a Greek Sororitas player, a 20-0 win against Finnish Tyranids, another 20-0 against the Undivided team's Custodes player, a 12-8 versus the Swedish Tyranids, another 12-8 versus the American Eldari player, a 20-0 against Necrons against Team English, and last but certainly not least, an 18-2 versus Polish Sororitas. So not only is that a 7-0 record for this list, I think going to show that Eric Lathuris definitely has a mastery over the Genestealer Cult faction, but also some of the strongest armies in the metagame. This isn't an army that's just getting softball matchups. He ended up beating 2 Tyranid players, an Eldari, a Necrons, and 2 Sororitas as well. So these games were not easy, but being able to use the unique benefits of Genestealer Cults for that 7-0 record. And congratulations to Team Australia for taking down the entirety of the event. But anyway, that's it. That's all of the wacky lists from the Warhammer 40k 2022 WTC. Let me know down in the comments if you notice any other wild lists that did pretty well that I didn't talk about in this video. And big thanks for watching all the way to the end. Big thanks as well for everyone who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers, all those people who help me keep the lights on over here at the Tactical Tortoise HQ. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.